Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Jake Gagne, and I'm the Jock Reynolds Fellow in Public Programs here in the Gallery's Education Department. I'm very happy to welcome all of you to this e-study tour, the first of 2021, which will address the topic of utopia and dystopia in modern European art. Our speakers today are Jenna Marvin and Elissa Watters. Jenna Marvin is the Marcia Brady Tucker Fellow in the Department of Photography. She has a BA from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and an MA in art history from Williams College and the Clark Art Institute. Jenna's research interests span the full history of photography and its intersections with science and the American South. Elissa Watters is the Florence B. Selden Fellow in the Department of Prints and Drawings. She received a BA from Dartmouth College and an MA in art history from Williams College. Elissa's research interests include European modernism, artists' books, and the history of printmaking. So Jenna and Elissa will each give a presentation of about 10 minutes, followed by a talkback, and then we'll have a question and answer period of about 20 minutes. We invite you to use the Q&A feature to submit questions for our speakers, and you can also use the chat feature to share comments or reach out to a staff member about any technical issues. Finally, I would just add that everyone here today will receive a follow-up email with some information about the artworks in today's presentations and a link to a short survey that will help us as we develop future programs. So thank you again for joining us, and I turn it over to Jenna Marvin.
Thank you, Jake, and hello, everyone. Welcome to our first e-study tour of the spring. At the gallery, both Elissa and I are very involved with the James E. Duffy Study Room for Prints, Drawings, and Photographs, located on the 4th floor of the Louis Kahn building. Normally, the study room is extremely active with visits from classes, students, scholars, and members of the general public who make appointments with us to see various objects in the gallery's prints and drawings and photography collections. We also frequently host public programs in this space, including monthly thematic tours. While we're conducting today's program virtually, we hope that when the study room reopens, you'll visit the space and see the objects that we're discussing today or other works of interest to you in person. Today, I will be presenting a case study of a work in the Yale University Art Gallery's collection, a photograph by artists Alexander Rodchenko and Varvara Stepanova that can help us think through utopian ideas about childhood in the early Soviet Union. We are greeted by two figures. Their stiff paper arms raised as if in greeting, their smiling faces and literally hollow eyes stare outside the frame. They wait to be activated in play. The Russian artists, Alexander Rodchenko and Varvara Stepanova, crafted these paper figures and photographed them as illustrations for a poem by the Russian writer and playwright Sergei Tretyakov in 1926. The poem, entitled Samozveri, or in English, Auto Animals, was never published, but the collaboration between Rodchenko and Stepanova and Tretyakov was intended to be an illustrated whimsical book for children about homemade paper animals. Though the poem and accompanying photographs were never published together, Rodchenko and Stepanova's prints were published as a 2-page spread in the journal, The New LEF. You can see the figures and the print in Yale's collection are also present in this image on the left side of the spread. The New LEF to the famed LEF, or Left Front of the Arts Journal, which was the official publication for the Russian Constructivists from 1923 to 1925. Stepanova and Rodchenko were both vocal and influential constructivists, working across a variety of media. The constructivists believed that artists were first and foremost laborers, professionals, not enlightened individuals who made art because of a spiritual calling. This positioning of the artist as laborer is consistent with the reorganization of Russian society as a whole that occurred after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. The constructivists sought to break with old-fashioned and elitist modes of representation to usher in a new kind of universal art for the people. In 1927, Sergei Tretyakov, the author of the poem Samozveri, revived the publication, dubbed it the new LEF, and published Rodchenko and Stepanova's photographs of his poem in its inaugural issue. Rodchenko's photography was also included on the edition's cover. Though Tretyakhov's poem is not printed alongside these photographs, the text is key to understanding these images. The poem describes 8 different animals and how a child would play with and imagine a world with a paper version of that animal. You can see some of the animals figured here: a horse, an elephant, a giraffe, and an ostrich. Let's look together at an English translation of the first stanza. Have I fallen from the moon? Elephants are a walk in the room. I see a kangaroo does bound behind the kennel of the hound. With the cuttlefish goes the seal. Along the hall I see them steal. The kitchen door stands ajar. A pair of turtles crawls quite far. Ah, help! Against the door I throw my bulk, crushed beneath the elephant's hulk. With my head against a beam, suddenly there comes a scream. There, coward, ah, how silly can I be? Surely they will not eat me, these animals. Auto animals. Tretyakov imagines the speaker, most likely a child, surrounded by wild animals, which are later revealed to be made of paper. Words and phrases like kitchen door and along the hall signal to us that the child is not in nature with these animals, but in a domestic space. With the poem in mind, I want to turn our attention back to Rodchenko and Stepanova's illustrations. What is perhaps most striking is the presence of paper people. In his poem, Tretyakov imagines paper animals and human children engaging in an imaginative game. But Stepanova and Rodchenko imagine what looks like a stage set with props and dramatic lighting, populated by paper children and animals together. Rodchenko and Stepanova's decision to create theater-like displays for these paper figures is intriguing, considering that Tretyakov was a renowned playwright. During the same period that Tretyakov was writing Samosveri, he was also writing and revising a play about raising children titled I Want a Baby. Though heavily revised at least once in order to appease the Communist Party censors, the plot centers around a woman named Milda who wants to have a child on her own, free from the burdens of middle-class morality and family life. She eventually succeeds, and her child wins an award at the quote-unquote exhibition of children for being an exemplary Soviet citizen. Ultimately, the play was never performed and banned because its message was ambiguous, and it was deemed too quote-unquote formalist and out of step with the regime's new socialist realist aesthetic. This new aesthetic is worth exploring in some detail, as Tretyakov, Rodchenko, and Stepanova would all have to amend or alter their working methods to stay in the good graces of the censors. Starting in the late 1920s, the Soviet regime began to favor images of everyday life with clear pro-Communist Party messages. This was at odds with the aims of the Constructivists, artists like Rodchenko and Stepanova, who sought universally understood truths, often through abstraction. This state-issued poster, dated circa 1920, reads, quote, "Join the preschool campaign, bring about communist change, build a new way of life," end quote. The faceless and unspecific children in the sky seem to be modeling the kind of play that Tretyakov describes in Samosveri. The architectural blocks bear a strong resemblance to the stage-like paper props that Rodchenko and Stepanova crafted for their photographs. Let's compare this poster with another dated 10 years later in 1930. This poster depicts unacceptable, quote-unquote, backbreaking labor on the left side of the image, with reasonable and healthy labor on the right. The style of this poster conveys a clear message: tired children on the left with content children on the right. The colors are bright and cheerful in this green and pleasant landscape, though the emphasis on play is no longer present. The caption states, quote, "By working within reason, a child strengthens his health and acquires abilities necessary for his life." While this poster seeks to address children's work specifically and not play or education, this change in style and tone is striking compared with the poster from 1920. With some understanding of how Soviet ideas about children's work, education, and play are changing at this time, we can return to Rodchenko and Stepanova's illustration of Tretyakov's poetry. We must again ask ourselves, why did the artists make paper people to activate the paper animals? when Tretyakov so clearly stages play between real children and paper animals. Of course, this work is a collaboration between three people who undoubtedly bring personal, nuanced views to this subject. I believe that the difference between Tretyakov's real children and Rodchenko and Stepanova's imaginary and idealized paper children is a productive one. Utopia, the topic of today's discussion, literally means no place, or in other words, a place that is unachievable, a daydream. Indeed, we know that some time after this series was completed, Rodchenko and Stepanova decided to experiment with the images as an animated film, hence the tight cropping and green tint that has been applied to the print in Yale's collection. Shifting away from Tretyakov's real children and paper animals, Stepanova and Rodchenko sought to create the ideal, playful child in a fantastical and cinematic world. I look forward to your thoughts, ideas, and questions when we move into our discussion. And with that, I will hand it over to my colleague Elissa, who will be speaking to us about dystopia as a theme in feminist art in Europe.
Thank you, Jenna, for that fascinating talk. I'm really looking forward to our conversation later. And hello, everyone. Auto Animals actually provides the perfect segue into my talk today, particularly when put next to Fortunato de Pero's Mechanical Dancer. The utopian ideals of the Russian constructivists, Italian futurists, and others would soon falter. World War I, which left 20 million dead, 21 million wounded, and countless cities leveled, called into question the benefits of modern technology, whose recent advances had enabled such vast destruction. A sense of dystopia emerged across post-war Europe. Germany is a particularly apt locus, I think, for examining this sense of dystopia. In addition to losing nearly 2 million men in the war and seeing millions more casualties, including an estimated 67,000 amputations, Germany subsequently suffered from extreme shortages of food and fuel, the 1918 flu pandemic, and huge hyperinflation and unemployment. And so it's to German artists specifically, and specifically female German artists, that I'd like to turn now, and particularly their engagement with technology to offer feminist critiques of modern society. German artist Angelika Hürle's work of the early 1920s epitomizes the disillusionment that emerged after World War I. In this drawing, entitled Head with Sign, Hand, Wheel, and Auto Horn, a figure composed of a fusion of human, mechanical, and plant-like forms appears disabled and dysfunctional. Instead of eyes, the figure has a sign or license plate. Instead of arms, it has a car horn on one side and a detached arm rooted in the soil nearby on the other. And instead of a torso and legs, it has a wheel that surely can roll downhill, but what about uphill? There appears to be no motor for powering its movement against gravity, nor a steering wheel or other means of controlling the direction in which the figure might move. While Hürle's androgynous, semi-mechanical figure recalls the disfigured male bodies visible in everyday post-war life, it also seems an apt representation of female disenfranchisement. During the war, women had become a substantial part of the German workforce and had gained physical, economic, and social autonomy. In 1918, they had also gained suffrage. And yet they continued to be paid less than their male counterparts, underrepresented in government, and otherwise constrained. Hürle's figure similarly appears on the one hand to move freely and easily, and on the other to be rooted in one place by the arm, or if mobile, at the mercy of the slope of the ground. The collages of Dada artist Hannah Hook similarly engage the products of mechanization to highlight both female empowerment and female disenfranchisement. In this collage of 1919 to 1920, entitled Cut with the Kitchen Knife Dada Through the Last Weimar Beer Belly Cultural Epoch of Germany, the head of female artist Käthe Kollwitz hovers above the body of female dancer Nidhi Inpekoven, suggesting a dichotomy between women as intellectuals and women as sexualized physical bodies. Below, Impa Coven appears again, bathing acclaimed male artist John Hartfield, infantilizing him. In a map at the bottom right, identifies the European countries where women had gained suffrage. The collage medium itself also plays into Hoch's commentary on gender roles and rights, tearing apart images produced and circulated en masse, usually under the direction of men, and rearranging them rearranging the fragments. Hoch's collages deconstruct and reconstruct both the products of modern technology and the gender constructs they represent. Austrian artist Steffi Kiesler's typoplastique works, such as this one, also challenge common conceptions of women in post-war European society. Using a machine, the typewriter, as not just an artistic tool, but quite literally her artistic arm, Kiesler dismantles notions of the female typist as rote worker and instead positions her as a creator. Just imagine the amount of time and effort it must have taken to feed this page through the typewriter, setting it up so that the letter blocks aligned to create each sparse but extremely precise line of type. Not only do the horizontal rows of X's and overlapping W's and M's appear perfectly aligned, but so too do the column of exclamation points and the diagonal line of dots. The resulting image is void of semantic meaning. Instead, it reveals the creative possibilities of individual alphabetic units as purely visual geometric artistic forms. Merging randomness and order, Kiesler's typoplastiques seem to exist at the border of freedom and confinement, embodying the female condition of the time. The horrors of the Third Reich and World War II only heightened a pan-European sense of dystopia felt particularly strongly in Germany. Surviving pen and ink drawings by little-known German artist Renate Geisberg-Wickman depict ravaged landscapes, bombed-out buildings, soldiers, refugees, and dead or dying bodies. Though drawn from the imagination, these drawings capture war-torn scenes in an almost objective documentary way. And yet, at the same time, the striking tonal contrasts and the stormy skies that rage above stilled, silent scenes of devastation pull at our emotions. We know little about Geisberg-Wickman, but imagine a female artist making drawings critical of the reigning totalitarian regime in secret in her home in Borglo, a town in the northwest part of Germany, where she, her artist husband, and her two sons lived during the war. Each 2 by 3 feet, the drawings are large for works made during the war when paper was in short supply. Moreover, they're enormous. They're enormous for woodblock prints, which is what the artist likely intended for them to become. Several woodcuts after other drawings of this scale survive. The 2 by 3 foot woodblocks must have been extremely heavy. Geisberg-Wickman must have had help lifting and manipulating them, but still the very physicality of the work she was doing challenges traditional conceptions of the role of women, mothers, and female artists alike. In the post-war era, a desire to forget the recent past and start anew clashed with the impossibility and irresponsibility of oblivion. This drawing by Geisberg-Wickman, dated 1951, illustrates the lasting physical and psychological impacts of the war. A woman, seen from behind and in silhouette, looks down upon ruins. I always wonder when I see this drawing, is she returning home only to find it destroyed, or is she leaving it behind in search of a new place to settle? Either way, the drawing proves the impossibility of realizing a new utopia in Germany after the war. It demonstrates that the notion of a so-called 0 hour was a myth. The end of the war did not mark a new beginning in which the actions and principles of the Nazi regime could be forgotten. 6 years after the war had ended, Geisberg-Wickman and others were still grappling with tangible reminders of the war, memories of it, and related feelings of responsibility, guilt, and loss. Dystopia could not be so easily shaken. Thank you. And now Jenna and I will have a conversation, after which we'll turn things over to Jake to moderate a Q&A. So if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A feature at any time.
Thank you, Elissa, for that really thought-provoking talk. I kind of want to pick up right where you left off, actually. That last Giesberg-Wickman print drawing is absolutely striking. And I kind of want to hear more about the idea of the 0 hour for Germany that you were talking about.
Yeah, it's it's like such a bizarre concept in my mind, the idea of a 0 hour, a kind of complete starting over. I mean, it's kind of like a total blank slate. Um, and actually the term had also kind of been applied to World War I. So it's interesting that it's a repurposed term. And I'll throw this question back to you in a moment, and you can talk about it in the Russian context. But it's interesting that the idea of there being multiple 0 hours is also kind of perplexing. But yeah, literally this idea that, May 8th, 1945, when the war effectively ended, as this kind of starting over, this kind of 0 hour, I think it really shows just how difficult it was for Germans and, really all of Europe, but particularly Germany, to kind of grapple with what had just happened, both to, German civilians who were still living and to victims of the Holocaust and others. It was really this kind of, I think, just impossibility. I think it was so hard just even to see the physical landscape so ruined and to have kind of gone through that kind of horror. And then to kind of, in retrospect, start to kind of figure out how it even happened. I think that was so difficult that there was this real attempt to completely dissociate from what had just happened and start over. And as kind of a part of that, there was this idea of kind of German victimization, where Germany very much positioned itself as a victim of a lot of what had happened. So for example, as victims of the Allied bombings, in which, hundreds of thousands of German civilians had been killed, what a lot of prisoners of war had undergone, German prisoners of war had undergone at Soviet hands. All of these kind of instances in which, Germans had been the victims kind of became the underlying narrative in many ways of the war. And I think that also played into this idea of, we can forget, we can just kind of say it's over and move on, undergo denazification, demilitarize and all that, and just kind of start anew. Which of course was a total myth. I mean, there was just no way to kind of start anew, and it would have been irresponsible to do so, and all that. So throwing it back at you, I would just kind of be curious. I know when we were talking yesterday, you mentioned that the term 0 hour has been applied in the Russian context. So I'd be curious to hear more about that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It ended up kind of being an unintentional point of contact between our objects and our talks. I think that, the Soviet Union has its own sort of 0 hour in 1917, though it's interesting that it's not talked about in quite the same way. I think your invocation of the term forgetting is really important. The kind of memory and history rewriting that occurred after the Bolshevik Revolution has been referred to as memory management, or a memory crisis. It's a year 0, it's a fresh start, but of course no such thing really exists. And that was something that I explored a lot in my research for this talk, was thinking about the ways that the Soviet Union was successful and unsuccessful in that regard, and trying to rewrite a Soviet history, but also acknowledge that it's a complete break with the history before the Bolshevik Revolution. So creating a narrative and also expunging a narrative, it's hard for those two things to happen simultaneously. And that concept of a year 0 is actually really helpful, I think, to apply to the idea of what the Constructivists were trying to do. They're trying to break with the past. They're trying to create a new kind of art that is abstract and yet universal. It's hard to do all of those things at one time. And it's hard to create easily digestible history. And, we're also talking about a time where it's considered a mass media revolution. It's easy to make and distribute photographs and films, and importantly, I think for both of us, prints. And with that, I actually wanted to ask you if you would provide maybe a little bit of context for the Soviet posters that I mentioned in my talk. I know that you've worked with them more than I have, and maybe you have some insight into their circulation display and their materials.
Sure. Yeah, it's an amazing collection that we received from Alan Shazanov, an artist who actually recently passed away just a couple months ago, but he gave us a collection of about 1,200 Soviet posters dating from the whole span of the Soviet time period. So basically like 1920s through through the 1980s. And I find them so fascinating because, like you said, this was an era of, mass production of printed materials. And the poster was just like rose to fame in Russia and really across Europe, especially in the kind of early 20th century. And the Soviets really put it to use, and they were highly censored materials. They were usually if not always state sponsored, and they were often produced in the hundreds of thousands. I mean, there were thousands of posters produced, but each individual poster design could be printed into the hundreds of thousands, and they were posted all over. I mean, you could find them in schools, in factories, on the street. I mean, they were really everywhere. So I think that it's really what you said about kind of circulation and the power of mass-produced prints in particular to disseminate information, whether for good or for bad, whether accurate or mythic, is really apt in the Soviet poster context. And just talking about like posters and thinking about ephemerality, because a lot of these posters weren't really meant to last. The whole kind of collection fad came into being a bit later, and the idea of collecting posters is kind of its own kind of interesting and kind of quirky topic. But I would be curious to think a little bit more about like ephemerality. And really, I was struck by the fact that Auto Animals is made of paper, and the idea of a children's toy being made of paper I find really intriguing, because I would think that, if someone actually were to play with it, it would be destroyed in like 2 minutes. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more in that context about ephemerality and what it means to be making these toy constructions out of paper.
Yeah, definitely. And Jake, yeah, that's great. That's the slide I want to see. Something I would love to know is whether in this, this children's book was unrealized, so we don't have a copy or a manuscript to refer back to, but I would love to know whether Rodchenko, Stepanova, and Tretyakov were thinking about including instructions on how to make the paper animals as part of the book. It wasn't uncommon for children's books in the Soviet Union, especially in the early years, maybe through the mid-1930s, which is kind of the year range that I'm thinking about. It wasn't unusual for them to include sort of DIY instructions on how to make handicrafts that could be toys, like model buildings, like even model factories I've seen. And underneath that, there's this idea that children's skills can be honed. They're little constructors in some ways. It's seen as being a sort of primer to what would make a good Soviet citizen, what would make a good Soviet worker. And it's a little bit unclear to me exactly how the authors thought of the paper animal, but it seems to me like it would be pretty ephemeral. Like paper wrinkles, all it takes is an errant hand or an errant foot to smash these paper toys. And so I imagine that it really is about honing that skill, because you would have to continually be making paper animals in this case, and in Rodchenko and Stepanova, imagining paper people. So it would be a continuous sort of struggle to keep your toys populated without wrinkles and tears. A question I've had while thinking about this is also, where does the creative process come in? Are these very kind of concrete and rigid instructions on how to make paper things, or would they have been a little bit more open-ended, make different animals, experiment with different ways of making them? Like, in what ways does creativity, mental creativity, not so much the creative impulse to make something with your hands, like in what way does that play in? which is really interesting. And I wish I knew the answer, but I don't think it exists, unfortunately.
That is really interesting. I've been wondering about that and just thinking about communism and the communist state, and obedience is really the way a communist state functions. You're supposed to listen to the authorities, and if everyone kind of does what they're told and gives the proper portions back to the state, then everything works. But otherwise things kind of sort of fall apart. So I would have been wondering about that, like thinking about toys and this idea of creativity. And even the poem that you read is so creative. I mean, it's kind of the weirdest scenario. Especially the ending is like, it's kind of bizarre, this idea of the animals almost being threatening. But yeah, I've been wondering, what the relationship between creativity and obedience is in a communist state.
Definitely. I would say creativity or play. Like in what ways is play a sort of subversive activity, right? And I don't know the answer to that, of course, but the idea of play, both in children's play and play for adults, a sort of intellectual experimentation or writing or kind of subverting state control of written and creative materials. Like the idea of play when transferred to adults seems far more threatening for a really centralized communist party. So it's an interesting thing to think about, is the way in which children's play can kind of be seen as a microcosm for larger issues that the Soviet Union is struggling with at this time. And, eventually, I talked about a little bit Soviet realism, the kind of really figural and literal aesthetic that Stalin's government is enforcing, essentially. It kind of gets away from that idea of creative play when the sort of aesthetics that one has to use to convey information become smaller and smaller and smaller. The possibilities are less and less as time goes on. But yeah, it's definitely a link that I've been thinking about. How can you take children's play and sort of use that as a case study to think more largely about the Soviet Union at this time? Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, also interesting in the poster context, just to think, or just art in general, to think about like what art under extreme censorship means, what element of creativity, we could even call it play, in creating art is allowed if you're, highly in this highly censored environment where you're being asked to make posters, for example, for a very specific, that kind of promote a very specific message or image.
Right. Definitely. And I mean, and there's some, similarity between what the Third Reich is doing at the same, or slightly later in the late 30s and 40s, about co-opting certain artists' work and taking it out of context, but also it has its own sort of aesthetic regime as well. I don't know how much that you can or want to talk about that, because you didn't really touch on it in your talk, but it's definitely a point of contact, I think.
Yeah, it's definitely there. I mean, I think that would be a whole, we could do a whole nother talk about state-sponsored art across time and across place. But that might be a little bit beyond our scope. But definitely, yeah, definitely. And actually an artist that I cut from the talk, Kata Kollwitz, although I mentioned her because she comes up in the Hannah Hook piece. She's an example of like a female German expressionist, actually, who's producing art that is very socially, it has to do basically with social justice issues. And the Nazi regime kind of co-opts a lot of her, some of her work to their own ends. So yeah, no, art, whether it's state sponsored or just kind of the state ends up kind of appropriating and kind of twisting the message behind the art, is kind of an interesting other topic.
Right. With that, Jake, do you want to ask some of the audience questions?
Sure. So we've gotten some questions already. A couple of them are more quick and factual, so maybe let's start there. So one audience member writes, "Absolutely fascinating talk. Thank you. I am blown away by the typewriter piece. Did you make more of these, or was it a one-off?"
I'm so glad you asked about this. This is one of my favorite pieces in the gallery. We have 4 of them. So Steffi Kiesler is really, I think, an under-recognized artist. She's so fabulous. And And so we have 5 works that are very similar to this. And I'm not sure whether she made more or not. These works came to us through Catherine Dreyer, an artist and kind of collector of her own right in New York, Connecticut, and the Société Anonyme group. And Kiesler, I'm just trying to think. Okay, so she produced these objects when she studied in Vienna. She moved to Paris with her husband in, I think, the early to mid 1920s, and she was there for a little while before she relocated to New York. She made these pieces, I believe, when she was in Paris, and some of them were published in a journal publication called Distill. Distill is also the name of a kind of an art movement at the time. And so when Kiesler published them, this I find fascinating, she used a male pseudonym, Pietro da Saga. So we already have, an artist that, is obviously kind of drawing on a sort of feminist, this idea of, the woman as typist, and kind of twisting that and subverting that. And then she's publishing these drawings, which are one-offs. Each one is a one-off, even though she made multiple. And she's publishing them under a male pseudonym. So I find all that interesting. And also the idea that they were published. And so they were kind of made reproducible, even though the original artwork is a singular piece, is kind of an interesting point of contact between the singular artwork and the reproducible or the reproduction of the artwork. And just kind of an interesting point here. And then there was one more thing I wanted to say on this. Oh, I know what it was. So these are actually on typewriter paper, which I guess makes sense because they were made using a typewriter. But I mean, if you just think of making these pieces, I'm sure she went through many trials before she actually got the final works the way she wanted them, because the amount of precision it must have taken, and the different ink colors, the black and the red ink, and then the overlaying of the letters. I mean, she must have made mistakes. So yes, the final pieces are one-offs, but I think that there was a very labor-intensive process for producing them. And then later they were reproduced in multiples, probably in some sort of, I don't know, as lithographs or something. I don't know, something more reproducible. Great question.
Elissa, I might add to that too, thinking about her life in New York. She was a librarian for the New York Public Library for many years, right? So the typewriter for her, it's also part of her daily life and work. She's a woman who worked in the 20th century, and I'm sure did a lot of typing that was not like this. So, that the medium has a strong work connotation for her as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, very interesting.
Do we know, this is another audience question, what type of typewriter Kiesler would have used?
I have no idea. Great question. I'm sure someone could figure that out, but yeah, no, I have no idea.
Fair enough. So question for Jenna about the auto animals. 2 questions. How did the poem rhyme in Russian and in English? And what is the actual size of the paper figures?
Those are both really great questions. As far as Russian and English, I actually have not read the poem in Russian. I'm not a Russian speaker, so I relied off of an English translation from the 1980s by translator Susan Cook-Sommer. So, translation is not an exact science. There's no one-to-one across any language of word to word. And so exactly what decisions Cook-Sommer made throughout translating is, it's a personal decision on her part. Whether she massaged certain words and phrases to make them rhyme, I don't know. It's, a personal decision on the part of the translator. So not entirely sure. And what was the second question, Jake? I've already forgotten.
The actual size of the paper animals.
That's right. Based on some of the other photographs that I've seen, I think they're roughly maybe 6 to 10 inches, possibly. They're meant to kind of be held in the hand of a child. They're not terribly large, doll size, essentially, kind of within the realm of toys. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. So this is a question, and I don't know if you want to answer this now, or maybe this is for a follow-up email, but someone asked for a bibliography or reading suggestions on both the general themes of today's talk and also about constructivism?
I can start with constructivism, then Elissa, maybe you and I can collaborate on Utopia and Dystopia. There are a couple of really, really great books on Soviet photography in particular. The first being The Soviet Photograph, 1924 to 1937, and that's by Dr. Margarita Chapitsin, and we can add that, a link to that book in the follow-up. She's very much thinking about how writers and critics are thinking kind of together with artist photographers, and thinking about how words and images are a really important sort of collaborative process within Soviet art. So it's definitely relevant to the kind of work that I'm thinking about today with Tretyakov and the accompanying photographs. And there was also a really great exhibition in, I believe it was 2017, and it is called Soviet Art Put to the Test. The exhibition catalog is great. It's, you know, definitely thinking through Soviet art and constructivism on the centennial of the 1917 revolution. And it's definitely worth a look. And I can add that link to the post survey as well. Yeah. And Utopia and Dystopia.
It's a big topic.
Yeah. I would say that this is perhaps very in the weeds, but one of the most important documents, books I was thinking about while writing this talk was Utopia by Sir Thomas More. And it's way out there outside of the time period that we're discussing today. It was written in the 16th century in England by Sir Thomas More, who was a statesman and humanist writer and part of Henry VIII's court. And it's kind of seen as the beginning of this genre of thinking about utopia as a place that's too good to exist. And it was a very important book to the Bolsheviks. He was highly venerated in Russia. And actually, it's technically St. Thomas More. He was canonized by the Catholic Church in the 1930s, right around this time. So it's a book written about 16th century European life that's held a great amount of sway at this time. So I was constantly going back to More to think through what I thought utopia meant in this context, and perhaps maybe what it meant to some of the constructivists as well.
Yeah, in terms of dystopia, I've actually been, I guess maybe this is just more like my specific research process, but I've been reading more about kind of Nazi Germany. That's like my focus right now. So actually the final two drawings that I talked about, by the two by Geisberg Wickman, that's kind of the focus of my current research project. And so I've been reading a lot about Nazi Germany, which isn't the same as reading about dystopia, but they're so relevant and there's so much written, especially now, there's so much new research on trauma and notions of trauma. So I've been doing a lot of reading about that. And kind of on the utopian side, I've read quite a bit about Italian Futurism, and Christine Poggi at the IFA and NYU has done some really great research on that, just kind of thinking about utopia in the Italian futurist context. So those are just some ideas.
Fabulous. Thank you both. That's great. And we can definitely put some of that in the follow-up email that you'll get. So another attendee asks, any linkages or echoes on the dys to utopia spectrum with the Bauhaus?
Would you like to go first, or would you like me to go first, Elissa?
You go first.
Okay. There's a very concrete link between what the constructivists are doing in Bauhaus. There's sort of a very similar design school in Moscow called I hope I'm not butchering the pronunciation, Fukutomas. And Rodchenko was an instructor there, as was Stepanova. She taught textiles, I believe, and he taught construction. So thinking through constructivist principles and sort of a national form of design art fusion. So there's definitely, at least in the early Soviet Union, there's a lot of communication between artists who are working in both. That does tend to tighten up as Stalin rose to power in the 1930s. But that link definitely does exist. And there is a sort of utopian notion in Bauhaus and Fukutomas as well. It's this fusion between the everyday, the functional, and how we design and construct the objects and things in our lives. And it is sort of a utopian gesture in a way as well. It's a great question.
And I would just bring up, I find it I think it's very relevant that the Bauhaus kind of forms in 1919, so right after World War I, and it goes until 1933, more or less, when the Nazis shut it down. And so there's a sort of, it's interesting because when we were putting this talk together, I was like, oh dear, like let's try not to make it, oh, pre-World War I is utopia and post-World War I is dystopia, because it's not that clean. And I think your mention of the Bauhaus really hits that on, like nails that on the head. It's like the Bauhaus was, during the interwar period, and it was, in many respects, there were a lot of utopian ideals embedded in its teaching approach. And for those of you who don't know, the Bauhaus was an art school in Germany that really focused on functionalism. Or that was there was a lot of variety within it, but one of the kind of main tenets was this idea of like functional art for the people, this idea of democratizing art and integrating art into everyday life in Germany and beyond. And it was an international art school. People came from all over Europe to study there. And some of the big names were like Gropius and Max Bill. But yeah, I think this idea that, there was a sort of utopianism even in the interwar period, post World War I, is something really important to keep in mind. And kind of hand in hand with that is the idea that there was a sense of dystopia to a certain degree before World War I. I mentioned Kata Kollwitz and a lot of her work. One of the reasons I kind of initially wanted to talk about her in this talk is that, the German expressionists in general were often really interested in issues of social in social issues, predominantly with the workers, like the coal workers, the coal miners in the Ruhr region of Germany. There were a lot of kind of issues with and revolts because of the way they were treated. And that was something that was imaged a lot, or, featured a lot in imagery of the German expressionist pre-World War I. So just to kind of think, just to I guess complicate the notions of utopia and dystopia, and to make it clear that, there isn't a clear line, or a clear shift from one to the other. It's a give and take.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. So we have a more sort of longer interpretive question about the auto animals. So this visitor writes, "Thank you for these fascinating talks. Concerning the Russian auto animals, I wonder whether placing the figures of the animals along with paper people isn't a form of utopian shift. The poem is actually rather frightening. The idea of wild animals inside a house is frightening. If you've ever had a raccoon in your house, you will know what that means. Adding people into the paper animal group makes a quote unquote good place, a land of cocaine, a land of peace, a world of play, in which animals and humans now get along together, and where those who manipulate them, i.e. the children, are allowed creative freedom." So I don't know if you would like to respond to that, Jenna.
It's something that I wrestled with something similar to that while I was writing this talk. So thank you. This is a great question. I knew that I wanted to pick a work to do this talk that was a collaboration between many people, because I don't think that we can pull one interpretation out of it. I think that there are many different ways to read both Tretyakov and Stepanova and Rodchenko's contributions to this, and I don't think that they're consistent in some ways. I think that the decision to make an animated film is in fact Rodchenko and Stepanova kind of moving away from the original source material to make it their own and kind of put their own stamp on what the idea of children's play and constructing paper animals means to them. And so, I have so many thoughts. The poem, I understand, the poem is quite frightening. It's a little strange. It kind of feels like this child is sucked into another world. And then at the end of the first stanza, you see that everything is all right. There's this idea of child's play being so immersive that it can become real, which I think can be interpreted as utopian. And I think that is sort of made manifest in the photographs, that the child and the animal exists on equal plane. There is a sort of totally imaginative aspect of it. It's not paper animals in a child's world. They exist together on equal footing, if that sort of answers the question. But it's a good question, definitely.
Yeah, these questions are all very, very thoughtful. So thank you all for contributing. So it's a question for Elissa about the key slur. Is it possible that the typewriter keys could be X's with M's overlaid or vice versa?
Oh gosh, I'd probably have to look at it again in the gallery. We're still working remotely, so so I probably have to look at it in person just to kind of try to splice that out. For some reason, I thought it was M's and W's, but it's possible that it's X's and M's.
Great. And so turning back to the auto animals for a second, one visitor writes, do little girls still play with paper dolls? Is there any relationship, even a very distant one, between those and the paper toys? Or is there no relationship other than their material?
Could you read that one more time?
Yes. Yeah. Do little girls still play with paper dolls? Is there any relationship between those paper dolls and the paper toys? Or is there no relationship other than their material? So I guess the question is, in this context, were paper dolls a popular toy?
You know, this is also, thank you for this question, because it's something that I actually went and asked a native Russian speaker about the translation for Samosveri, because auto animals to me seemed, I mean, I really like that translation. I think that the invocation of auto is really important. It kind of brings that sort of constructor mechanized sort of viewpoint into the actual language, which is great. But I was thinking, is there no term in Russian like paper dolls that we have? We understand what paper dolls mean in English. That has a kind of web of connections. We understand that they're, you know, for kind of fashion plates, and usually they're associated with girls, not boys. And we have this whole sort of web. Is there a similar concept in Russian, and is that what Samosveri actually means? And the answer is no. The literal translation is self beasts, or DIY beasts, which is really interesting when you think about it. So, you know, in some ways I want to say that the paper is sort of incidental, but it's also interesting to think about the kind of changes that happened in children's lives in 1917, 1918. The work by Varvara Stepanova that I showed briefly in the presentation is actually a sketch for unisex clothing. There is a real emphasis in children's play to kind of take it out of the domestic space. Dolls are not encouraged. This sort of genderless idea of play is really, really, I don't want to say the word popular because that's sort of trivializing, but it's definitely part of the Soviet ideology at this time, that the society is moving past this idea of gendered play, racialized play, and toward a more universal and unisex definition of what a toy is. And so the doll comparison, it's there to us, I think, as modern viewers of this, but for someone in Soviet Russia in the 1920s, I don't know if that connection would have been the same. I can't say for certain, but it's definitely an interesting concept to think about, what ways our modern definitions of dolls and paper toys sort of inflect backward onto these objects. But it's a really good question.
That's great. I love DIY beasts.
Yeah.
It's lovely. So this is more of a like sort of general or meta question for both of you, but and I think you've touched on the idea that dystopia and utopia are kind of slippery concepts that shift and are like historically specific and always contain kind of contradictory elements. So I guess like thinking about how we are discussing art in the context of this tour as a way to kind of like both illustrate concepts, but also like actually think through concepts and refine them as we go. As you were picking artworks to talk about today, what were you looking for? Or like what sort of working ideas and definitions guided you? And do you feel like preparing this tour has changed your thinking or opened up new questions for you? So I know that's very broad, but wherever you'd like to enter that question.
That's a really good question.
Yeah, so and just because I think you both touch on so many themes in your talks, like gender, labor, childhood, um, politics. It seems like there's any number of entry points. So I'm just curious how you found your way into the topic.
I can start, Elissa, if you want.
Sure.
Well, I brought up Sir Thomas More and thinking through the book Utopia because I wanted to think about why that book that's written in 1516 has held such sway. Like, I had to read it in high school. I think that was one of the earliest things I read in high school, other than Shakespeare, probably, at least in European literature. And so why does this book hold an incredible amount of sway? Why is St. Thomas More canonized by the church? And I think part of the reason returning to that book is seeing that utopia is, like you said, so slippery. It's impossible to pin down an interpretation of that book. It's hard to see exactly in what ways is Thomas More critiquing 16th century English society and saying things should be this way, or what is he pointing out to say this is a ridiculous idea? Like, where does critique and satire, where does that line fall? And I think because we have no idea that that is actually a really important concept to utopia, that it's different for everyone. Everyone has a different idea of what is thinkable or unthinkable, what is possible and impossible. And that is why I wanted to work on a piece that was a collaboration, because every person who contributed to this project had a different idea of what was thinkable and what was not. And so the kind of slippage or kind of conflict between the different iterations of this project we see is because what is thinkable and unthinkable changes with every person and changes within their context, right? What year is it? What nation do they live in? It's very slippery and deeply personal to everyone. That was a long, convoluted answer, but
I guess in a similar vein, I think that one of the things this talk made me realize, and I think we sort of knew it to begin with, like when we came up with the title, Utopia and Dystopia in modern European art, we were like, okay, there's no way we can cover all that ground. So, Jenna decided to kind of focus on Russia and I decided to focus on Germany. And I think that just has to do with, at least for me, it had to do with my research interests at this moment. But I think it was really interesting to think about how you really can kind of, I don't want to say you can slot all of, modern art into this dichotomy, because that would be extremely limiting to modern European art. But there is a way in which so much of modern European art is dictated, dictated isn't the right word, but is shaped by World War I and World War II. I mean, these two wars just devastated the many portions of the European population and had a huge kind of physical and psychological impact. And so I think that, dystopia and utopia are slippery terms, but when it comes to like large scale war of that scale, dystopia is kind of, I don't know if anyone's going to argue with that term being applied to, the European landscape during those years. So, and artists are really responding to that. And I mean, you can think about Dada and Surrealism would be one way of kind of thinking about like the ultimate kind of, in many ways, breakdown of, or kind of crisis that people went through of like, what does the world, like, what does life mean? What is going on here? How do we make sense of this? And then on the flip side, you have, artists like Kandinsky or the Italian Futurists, or the Bauhaus, who are, taking kind of a slightly different approach and saying, okay, well, let's like, they're kind of like either in the pre-war period, sometimes they're just thinking about technology as a good thing, and spiritualism is kind of providing a new way of looking at the world in a positive way. In the interwar period, you kind of have this focus on functionality and this kind of return to order, so to speak. And that comes back a little bit in post-World War II. But I think that utopia and dystopia provide kind of an interesting lens for looking at kind of all of modern European art, just because they do provide sort of a way into grappling with the issue of war, which I think is just something that we have a really hard time wrapping our heads around, because it's so hard to imagine all the different or to really like fully grasp all the different ramifications of that scale of war or destruction. So yeah, I guess that's kind of what I've been thinking about, is, how this maybe provides a slightly different way of looking, a slightly different, but in many ways all encompassing way of looking at modern European art.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think the philosophical, political issues that you've identified are world historical in scale. So Utopia and Dystopia can help us maybe parse them out a little bit. So we are at 1:30 and want to be respectful of everyone's time. But thank you so much, Elissa and Jenna, for your fascinating presentations and for taking questions. I think it's been a really illuminating session. And if anyone in the audience has follow-up questions, is it okay if they reach out to you with, just to get more information about the works or discuss further? And again, we'll send a follow-up email with some of the artworks discussed today and then the book recommendations that were discussed earlier. So thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you at future programs, and have a lovely Friday.
Thank you all, and thank you, Jake.